Question 1. Is consumerism an essential element of America's identity?
大家好，我是陈雨婷，今天来学习1920年代的政治、创新和经济。目标是学习1920年代政治家如何支持企业，了解美国人在1920年代如何改变他们的购物习惯，以及这些改变的代价是什么，和了解为什么一些美国人认为这些变化会对国家不利。目的是1920年代是经济对大多数人有利的时期，拥有这个年代最新的东西很重要。
Americans love to go shopping. We even have a holiday for shopping, Black Friday. Of course, we were not always like this. The first colonists had no stores after all. So when did we become a nation of shoppers? And since we did, has shopping become an essential part of what makes us who we are? Would we still be American if we didn't shop? Has consumerism come to be a defining element of our national identity? What do you think?
消费主义是美国身份的基本要素吗？
A return to laissez-faire.
1920年3位共和党总统决定通过减少税收的监管来推行自由放任政策，结果却是商业活动增加，更高的工资导致更高的支出，人们记得这10年是最富足的时期。然而哈定总统的政府受到丑闻的困扰，包括茶壶山丑闻案。
The election in 1920 saw the end of one group of progressive leaders. When former Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson died, so did many people's excitement about progressive ideas. Wilson's support of the League of Nations turned many people who had come from Ireland and Germany against the Democrats. Americans were tired of change and ready for a return to normalcy. Most of all, the 1920s was a time when the government went back to helping business instead of regulating business. It was a time of a return to the laissez-faire ideas of the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. Calvin Coolidge's idea that the chief business of the American people is business, often written as the business of America is business, became the main idea of the times. During the 1920s, America's leaders tried to lower taxes, get rid of government regulation, and let business leaders do as they pleased. In the election of 1920, many Republicans were ready to choose a man whom they could control. Warren G. Harding, a senator from Ohio, was just such a man. Harding was known for enjoying golf, alcohol, and poker, but not always in that order. Some people who didn't like him thought he was weak, lazy, or unable to get things done. He was actually quite clever and politically wise. Together with his running mate, Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, they attracted the votes of many Americans who wanted Harding's promised return to normalcy, a word he invented. In the election, Harding won by the greatest amount in the history of two-party politics. Harding won 61% of the vote. Harding's cabinet showed his pro-business goals. Herbert Hoover, a rich mechanical engineer and miner, became his Secretary of Commerce. Hoover had served as head of the plan to raise money for Belgium during World War I and helped to feed those in Russia and Germany after the war ended. He was a very good manager, trying to lower waste in the government and helping create partnerships between government and business. Harding's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, was also a rich pro-business leader. Even more so than Hoover, Mellon thought government should run as well as any business, and he wrote that the government is just a business and can and should be run on business principles. Harding proposed and signed into law tax cuts and created a presidential budget director. He also signed a law that required the president to submit a budget to Congress once each year. These changes helped the government pay back some of the money that the United States had borrowed during World War I. Harding did some good things, but Harding's team has gone down in history as full of problems. While Harding was honest, he worked with people who were not. Harding made the mistake of often turning to old friends and people who told lies. These old friends, nicknamed the Ohio Gang, gave Harding many problems. "I have no trouble with my enemies," he once said. "I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my friends, my goddamned friends, they're the ones who keep me walking the floor at nights." From 1920 to 1923, Secretary of the Interior Albert B. Fall was involved in a scam that became known as the Teapot Dome scandal. Fall had sold the Navy's oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and 2 other places in California. The main problem was not that he was selling the government's oil, but that he had sold it to businesses owned by his friends in secret. In return, the companies gave him $300,000 in cash, as well as cows for his farm. Fall went to jail for taking money from the oil companies and had to pay $100,000. It was the first time that a cabinet official had to go to jail. In 1923, Harding also learned that the head of the Veterans Bureau, Colonel Charles Forbes, had stolen most of the $125 million that was being saved for fancy events. Forbes served 2 years in prison. Harding was not president for the normal 4 years. In July 1923, while traveling in Seattle, the president suffered a heart attack. While he was still weak, he had a stroke and died in San Francisco. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took over as president. Coolidge ended the problems, but did little more than that. Coolidge stuck to his idea that the business of America is business. Coolidge thought the rich had things because they were good, and that being poor was because of something people had done wrong. Most of all, Coolidge thought that since only the rich best knew about business, the government should let business leaders take care of their businesses with as little government regulation as possible. So, staying quiet and doing nothing are what people remember about Coolidge. Coolidge was famous in Washington, D.C. for doing and saying very little. People tell the story of how, at a dinner party at the White House, a woman bet her friends that she could get Coolidge to say more than 3 words. He looked at her and said, "You lose." After winning the 1924 election, Coolidge chose not to run again in 1928. Republicans turned to Herbert Hoover. The Democrats picked Alfred E. Smith of New York. Smith was everything that small-town people and farmers in America hated. He was Irish, Catholic, and a big city politician. He was fancy, and he talked a lot. Most people thought what really was important was that they had enough money. They thought the Republican presidents were the ones who had made sure things were good. In the end, Hoover won easily, with 21 million votes over Al Smith's 15 million. In the end, all 3 Republican presidents of the 1920s were the same. They tried not to make changes, let business leaders do what they did best, and enjoyed the good economy that was the result. The automobile.
1920年代让许多美国人能够拥有汽车的一个年代，特别是由于小利福特实施的生产创新，汽车改变了很多。由于汽车的普及，加油站、铺好的道路、汽车旅馆和在汽车里接吻都是新事物。
An invention that changed American life in the 20th century was the car. It showed how the economy was growing in the 1920s. The idea of the car was not new in the 1920s, but Henry Ford made it more common. Ford used the idea of the assembly line for making cars. In Ford's factories, instead of training each worker how to build a whole car, he trained each worker to complete just one step. Then, the cars moved through the factory, beginning with just parts at one end and leaving as finished cars on the other end. He paid his workers $5 a day, when most workers were paid $2, hoping that it would help them do more work. Also, they might use their extra money to buy a new car. Ford cut options and the Model T sold for $490 in 1914, about 1/4 what a car cost 10 years before. By 1920, there were over 8 million people who had bought a car. The car changed America. Businesses like glass, steel, and rubber factories grew to keep up with car making. The oil industry in California, Oklahoma, and Texas grew as Americans' need for oil grew and the nation went from using coal to using gas as the main source of power. Local and state governments had to pay for new roads. People in the suburbs stopped using streetcars and started driving their own cars. Even the federal government became involved with the Federal Highway Act of 1921. Gas stations were built all over, and mechanics began to earn a living fixing cars when they broke down. Travelers on the road needed places to stop to sleep on long trips, so motels began to line the major long-distance roads. The car led to many changes in the way people lived in America. Important American foods such as hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, and apple pies became a symbol for new restaurants that were built along the roads. Drivers wanted cheap, fast food, so they spent their time doing other things. But the growth of new businesses meant that some other businesses started to die away. Since Americans started to use cars, the nation's trains were used less. While Europeans spent money on mass transit, Americans spent money to build new roads, parking lots, and gas stations to support cars. The car also led to social changes too. Families were now free to travel to places they couldn't before. People in the city could travel and see beautiful natural places, while farmers could drive to shop in towns and cities. Teenagers found more freedom since they could now travel where they wanted to do. Boyfriends and girlfriends found that a car was a place to be alone, and ideas about what was okay for people to do before marriage started to change. There were some bad things about cars. America had the first traffic jams and accidents. The government made people get a license before they could drive. There were bad things about cars, but America loved them. Airplanes.
在1920年代，飞机的新产品最著名的是查尔的斯林德伯格，成为第一个从纽约直飞巴黎的人，成为美国伟大的英雄。
The 1920s not only saw a change in the way people traveled on land, but also big changes in air travel. By the mid-1920s, men, as well as some women, like the African-American pilot Bessie Coleman, had been flying for 20 years. Americans who had learned to fly during World War I bought the planes the Army was selling after the war and traveled around the country. They would land in an open field and sell rides to people who, having never seen an airplane before, came from miles around to see the amazing airplanes. These barnstormers, a name they were given because of the trick of flying through a barn with doors open at both ends, made the airplane familiar across America. In the 1920s, many people did not think that airplanes would ever be a way to travel. However, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly alone across the Atlantic Ocean, flying from New York to Paris in 33 hours. Lindbergh's flight made him an international hero, the best-known American in the world. On his return, Americans gave him a parade through Manhattan. His flight, which he completed in the monoplane Spirit of St. Louis, was a success and showed that Americans could do great things with an airplane. After Lindbergh's flight, the small airline industry began to grow, and by the 1930s, companies like Boeing and Ford created airplanes made for passenger air travel. In 1934, the number of passengers on airplanes was just over 450,000 each year. By 1940, that number had grown to nearly 2 million. Consumerism and credit.
美国成为一种消费文化，拥有最新的东西成为生活中重要的组成部分，尤其是冰箱和吸尘器等新的电子发明。当他们买不到这些东西时，美国人就借钱，负债累累变得很普遍。这是普通美国人开始在股票市场上购买股票的时期。有些人做出了借钱购买股票的冒险选择， 然而，由于这10年中的大部分时间生意都很好，即使是借钱的投资者也通常最终赚到了钱。
The 1920s was a time when many people in the middle class had enough money to buy new things to make their lives easier. Before the 1920s, only rich people were able to pay for these fancy things. Some of these things were vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, washing machines, and electric irons. Stores created advertising to get people to buy these new inventions and made people think that everyone should have them. New inventions made the lives of women easier because it was women who had to take care of housework. Before the 1920s, women spent most of their time cleaning, sewing, and taking care of their homes. By the end of the 1920s, they were able to buy clothes at stores and find food in supermarkets. The inventions of the 1920s really helped women have more free time. The stock market. Buy now, pay later was an idea that many middle-class Americans had in the 1920s. For a family with only one adult who had a job, all these new items were impossible to afford at once. However, stores wanted the people to buy everything. Department stores opened up lines of credit for those who could not pay up front, but could show that they could pay in the future. Installment plans were invented for shoppers who wanted to pay for things little by little over time. This was offered to buyers who could not afford the one-time payment, but could afford 12 easy payments. Over half of the nation's cars sold on credit by the end of the 10 years. People borrowed a lot more money in the 1920s than they had ever done before. In modern times, we are comfortable with the idea of owing money. Credit cards are a form of owing money in which we buy things with the promise of paying off our bill at a later date. But in the 1920s, this kind of shopping was new. While Americans were getting used to the idea of buying things they wanted with borrowed money, they were also beginning to be curious about the stock market. To be sure, the stock market was not new, but for the first time in the 1920s, everyday Americans started to buy stocks. As the government passed laws and cut regulation that helped big companies, their stocks did well. As 10 years slowly went by and stocks continued to rise, so did the demand for stock. Buying and selling stock was not really a problem. Today, Americans risk their savings in the stock market, knowing that prices may fall. However, the 1920s were different because Americans borrowed money to buy stock. This was called buying on margin, and meant that people borrowed cash to buy a stock, which they could later sell when the stock price goes higher. Then, they would use the money that they made to pay back the money they had borrowed. If everything worked out, they would have some extra money left over. If stock prices only rose, the system worked well, and as stocks rose and rose during the 10 years, more people bought stocks on margin. Of course, if a stock's value fell, they would have to sell the stock and pay back the loan. This would lead them to owe money. Buying on margin was a risky way to invest, and in 1929 led to trouble. The lost generation.
并非所有美国人都认为这种对拥有事物和赚钱的新强盗是个好主意。一群被称为迷失的一代的作家认为美国人已经失去了对上面的认识，并且这些主题为中心写成了小说。
As old ways of life were replaced by new, some did not like how things were changing. Although anything seemed possible, it also felt like Americans were trying to forget World War I by shopping, drinking, dancing, playing, and driving their way to happiness. It seemed as if Americans were trying to lose themselves in anything shiny and new. To show this idea that what was good about America was being lost, a new group of writers appeared. Called the Lost Generation, many of these writers moved away to the city of Paris, France. The name Lost Generation first appeared in Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, which is about a group of Americans in Europe during the 1920s. Hemingway said the name came from Gertrude Stein, who was his guide and helped him while he was in Paris. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about how people wanted and had too much in the 1920s. He and his wife Zelda lived among the rich people in New York, Paris, and on the French Riviera. The Great Gatsby, his most famous book, is about how it was bad that Americans only thought about having new, fancy things. T.S. Eliot wrote about how American life was empty in a popular poem called The Waste Land. Sinclair Lewis also did not like the middle class's way of life and wrote about it in his book, Main Street. After many successful books, Lewis was the first American writer to win a Pulitzer Prize. Some of the names related to the Lost Generation group of writers were not part of Hemingway's friends in Paris after the war, but are included because their early years or childhood happened just before or during World War I. Some of these writers are John Dos Passos, Walter Pierce, Alan Seeger, John Steinbeck, Sherwood Anderson, Aldous Huxley, Malcolm Croly, Isadora Duncan, James Joyce, and Henry Miller. The Lost Generation was created because of World War I. American modern writers wrote about the mental harm and religious scars the war had caused, which were ideas in Hemingway's writing and in Fitzgerald's book, This Side of Paradise. Another book called All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque was written in 1929, and it talks about the scary things of World War I. A movie released in 1930 based on the book was nominated for 4 Academy Awards and won 2.
Conclusion. During the 1920s, technologies were changing and the world was exciting. It seems like there was nothing that could not be done. Lindbergh had hopped the Atlantic and business was booming. Politicians cleared the way for entrepreneurs to produce new products for Americans to buy with newfound wealth. Refrigerators, automobiles, and toasters appeared in many homes. And when there wasn't enough money to buy something a neighbor had, we bought on credit. Some writers and philosophers questioned this new obsession with shopping and money, just as commentators do each November now as shoppers line up after Thanksgiving dinner to score the latest bargains. We may love Black Friday deals now and be obsessed with having the latest thing in the 21st century, but our love affair with consumerism began in the 1920s. Has our shopping habit come to define us? Does shopping make us unique in the world? Is consumerism an essential part of what makes us American? What do you think?
消费主义是美国身份的基本要素吗？